As many of you know, this program was scheduled weeks ago, long before the events of the last week occurred. However, given the situation, we continued with our plans, but have adjusted our program to a great degree. I think, as many of you know here, Jim and I have spent a great deal of time in the Middle East, especially in Israel and Palestine. It's an area of the world that is very dear to us. We were there most recently this last March, and our time in that area goes way back to 1967-68. Two of our children were born in Jerusalem, and we have many, many dear Israeli and Palestinian friends. So, as you can imagine, we are very involved in this conflict, in this program. Just to give you an idea of the terrible situation we are in today, today's count on the news is that to date, over 1,300 Israelis have died in this present conflict, and over 2,500, 2,300 Palestinians have lost their lives. That includes about 280 Israeli soldiers and 500 Hamas fighters. In addition, well over 1 million people have lost their homes so far and have become displaced and are on the move from the northern Gaza Strip farther south, which we'll talk about later. And as you can imagine, people are terrified, and they are also evoking memories of the Holocaust for Israeli Jews and also for Palestinian Arabs, major displacements that took place in 1948 with over 700,000 people being displaced from their homes, and in 1967 again with over 100,000 more. So, and none of these people have been able to return to their former homes. So you can imagine the overwhelming terror and fright that people are experiencing today, both Israeli Jews and Arabs. Let me just bring my initial presentation to an end by quoting Peter Baynard in a very important article that he has written and that's been published in today's opinion piece of the New York Times. As he said, and as I just said, many people feel, like many others who care about the lives of both Palestinians and Jews, I have felt in recent days the greatest despair I have ever known.
And we'll begin with some of the simplest demographic and geographical background to the conflict, which I hope you'll be familiar with, and this will be a review, but so we all understand the human and the geographical dimensions of what's going on now. Israel rules a population that is about equally divided between Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs. The Palestinian Arabs are divided in different territories. About 20% of the Israeli citizenry are Palestinian Arabs with Israeli citizenship. Many more Palestinians in the West Bank living under military occupation, about 2.7 million, and about 2.1 million Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip, surrounded by the Israeli military. It's hard for us to conceive how restricted the theater of this conflict is. That is the state of Vermont, upside down, I think, superimposed on all of Mandate Palestine, on all of Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza, approximately the same size. When we speak about the West Bank, we're speaking about an area, roughly the area of the state of Delaware. And when we speak of the Gaza Strip, we're speaking of an area that's roughly equivalent to the Central Bucks and New Hope Solebury school districts. That's the area where the present conflict is unfolding. An area that has already seen more than 6,000 bombs dropped in the last 5 days. And now, as I'm sure you all know from the news, Israel has ordered the population of the northern part of the Gaza Strip, the pink area on the map, to move south of Wadi Gaza, to move south of the Gaza River to avoid the coming invasion. Now, for friends, it's particularly important, I think, to know the history that Quakers have in the conflict as a whole, but also in Gaza. In a sense, Quakers got into this conflict because of two things: the missionary work that evangelical friends did with Palestinian Arabs in the middle of the 19th century going forward, establishing schools that are still operating and have become, for those of you in Bucks County, the George School of Palestine. Very, very prestigious and very, very good schools educating generations of Palestinian leaders. At the same time, the American Friends Service Committee, European Quakers, and other friends made an extraordinary effort during the Holocaust to rescue European Jews. For 4 years, AFSC devoted a third of its budget to its operations in Europe, trying to get as many Jews out of Europe as possible. The Quaker delegation met with the Gestapo to propose to them that they allow the Quakers to facilitate the exit of all Jews who wished to leave Germany. That did not work. The AFSC approached the U.S. State Department to propose that Quaker volunteers beef up the staffs in the embassies in Europe to permit the issuance of more exit permits for Jews. Again, it did not work. But that history of concern for the Jewish people and engagement with the Palestinians led the United Nations to call Quakers in the aftermath and in the midst of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, Israeli War of Independence, Palestinian catastrophe. And the UN asked Quakers to administer all international relief aid for Palestinian Arabs in southern Palestine, while the International Committee of the Red Cross was responsible for aid in northern Palestine. In practice, for friends, that meant that Quakers set up the refugee camps in the Gaza Strip in 1947 and 48, the camps that began as tent camps and which persist today as medium-rise apartment blocks for the most part, with the same names as the camps had in 1948. In the course of my surfing the internet for information, I found this piece by a former AFSC colleague. Burl Scheel served with us in Gaza when we were with the Service Committee in Jerusalem. And Burl has written this piece about the original refugee experience. It was published in the Journal of Palestine Studies in 1988. But and I was looking for this number, initially there were about 200,000 Palestinian refugees that Friends cared for in the Gaza Strip right after 48. So Friends have had a long involvement with Gaza. More recently, this is the latest example of AFSC involvement with Gaza, a compilation of writings from Gaza authors that was just published a few months ago. And in fact, I think one or two of the authors are still engaged in a West Coast speaking tour to highlight this book. So Friends have had a long history with this conflict, and with Jews and with Arabs. You probably know again from the news that the Gaza Strip has been under an Israeli blockade for the last 16 years, since Hamas took over in a coup, took over in elections, and then the U.S. and Israel sponsored the Palestinian Authority to try to carry out a coup against Hamas rule in 2007. That failed, and Hamas has ruled the Gaza Strip ever since 2007. This will undoubtedly be the worst fighting between Hamas and Israel, but it's not the first round since 2007. You can see from the charts here that the casualty tolls were high, but very different from what they are today already. In 2008, 1,400 Palestinians killed, 13 Israelis killed. 2012, a much lower death toll, 167 Palestinians, 6 Israelis. 2014, another high toll on the Palestinian side, 2,100 versus 73. There was another clash with smaller scale casualties in 2021. When we hear that the population of northern Gaza is ordered to leave to southern Gaza, you can see the implications of that from this population density map. Half the population lives north of that Wadi Gaza barrier. So more than 1 million people are on the move. This is the result of a Wikipedia search for Israeli-Palestinian massacres. And as you can see, the list is horrifyingly long. Already, the massacre at the music festival in southern Israel is on the list. It's highlighted here in yellow. It's joined one of many massacres that have occurred over the years, although you would have to go back to 1948 to see things on or near this scale, where in that war there were massacres committed by both sides, but far more civilians died at the hands of Israeli forces than the other way around. So, issues. The first, of course, is the current violence. And here, just again to quote Peter Boehner, who, if he were a rabbi, would be my rabbi, even though I'm not Jewish. His writings and his concern for Jews and Arabs is just incredible. And as he points out, Israelis have just witnessed the greatest one-day loss of Jewish life since the Holocaust. And for Palestinians, especially in Gaza, where Israel has now ordered more than 1 million people to leave their homes, the days to come are likely to bring dislocation and death on a scale that should haunt the conscience of the world. And for Palestinians, will evoke the Nakba, the catastrophe, the 700,000 displaced of 1948, just as the Hamas massacre evokes the Holocaust for Jews. And these you've probably seen in maps in the media of where Hamas attacked. I don't think anyone who follows this conflict could have anticipated the scale and the precision of the Hamas attack. Not only were the Israeli security forces taken by surprise, I think everyone who has ever attended to this conflict has been astonished by what has happened. And here, friends, I think we can be very grateful for our Quaker organizations. Immediately, AFSC and the Friends Committee on National Legislation had action alerts out to us, to our constituencies, with practical, useful politically salient things to do to try to make a difference. And if Friends should ever want to punch above our weight, now is the time to do it. So we are very, very fortunate to have these excellent organizations representing our interests and representing Quaker values. I should say that the request to members of Congress for statements urging a ceasefire and urging de-escalation have borne some fruit. 55 members of Congress, sad to say, almost all progressive Democrats, not sad to say, but sad that there were no others to join them, have called on the administration to exercise all of its influence to prevent civilian casualties and to move towards de-escalation. So there is the issue of Hamas violence, but there's also the issue of Israeli violence with the death of civilians. I will say our president has at least repeatedly made reference to the need to observe the laws of war and the need to prevent civilian casualties to the greatest extent possible. But of course, the proof in that pudding lies in the interpretation and in exactly how much the U.S. is willing to do to minimize and to try to restrain the Israeli assault that's coming. So now we go back to the issues that we were prepared to discuss before the events of the last week. First and foremost, anti-Semitism. This is a statement from the Anti-Defamation League. Undoubtedly, anti-Semitic incidents have been on the rise in the West, in Europe, in the United States. 36% is as good an estimate of the increase as any, I would think, from the Christian nationalist movement, from the white supremacist movement, unrelated to the Middle East conflict, although Middle East conflict gets very quickly drawn into concern with and the controversy over anti-Semitism. There have been in the global Jewish community for a number of years now debates about the definition of anti-Semitism and about the relation of anti-Semitism to criticism of Israel. And I think it's important for Friends to know that there are two major definitions of anti-Semitism that have been created in the Jewish community. One, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which people refer to as the IHRA definition. And the other, which is really a reaction against that by about 300 Israeli scholars of the Holocaust and human rights experts and others, called the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism. And I just call your attention to the significant difference between the two. The IHRA definition, which many conservative pro-Israeli organizations are encouraging countries and organizations to adopt, and which the United States State Department has adopted, defines something as anti-Semitic as denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination. That is, for example, by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor, versus the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, denying the right of Jews in the state of Israel to exist and flourish collectively and individually as Jews in accordance with the principle of equality. There is, when you start thinking about that, quite a bit of difference. And to make it more clear, the Jerusalem Declaration specifically says that these things are not anti-Semitic on their face, although they could certainly be said by anti-Semites, that's possible. Criticizing or opposing Zionism as a form of nationalism, or arguing for a variety of constitutional arrangements for Jews and Palestinians, it is not anti-Semitic to support arrangements that accord full equality to all inhabitants, whether in two states, a binational state, a unitary democratic state, a federal state, or in whatever form. The signers of this declaration may not agree with all of those, but they agree that advocacy of any of those outcomes should not be considered anti-Semitic. Related to what is and what is not anti-Semitic is the issue of apartheid, which, as the years have passed, has been used in relation to the present reality in which Israel governs an equal number of Palestinian Arabs, but the vast majority of those Palestinian Arabs live under military occupation and have no rights. You may remember that Jimmy Carter got himself in a lot of hot water in 2006 by the title of his book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. Back in 2006, it was much more plausible to try to defend the two-state solution. And the argument was then, from Carter and from many American Jews and others, that if Israel did not withdraw from the West Bank and Gaza, from the Palestinian population centers, but continued to impose a military government on them, it would become something like South Africa. It would become a situation of apartheid. Carter was accused of being an anti-Semite, despite all that he had done to bring peace between Israel and Egypt for that. But the ironic thing is that at least two Israeli prime ministers have voiced the same concern. Ehud Olmert, who was the Israeli prime minister in 2007, without a two-state solution, he said, Israel will, and I think this was in 2020, face a South African-style struggle for equal voting rights. The Jewish organizations, which were our power base in America, will become the first to come out against us because they will say they cannot support a state that does not support democracy and equal voting rights for all its residents. And Ehud Barak, another Israeli prime minister in 2010, if this bloc of millions of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza cannot vote, that will be an apartheid state. 13 years ago. And I couldn't refrain from adding Meron Ben-Venisti to this. Meron was an old friend of the Friends. May his memory be a blessing. He suggested in 2012 that the apartheid label was wrong-headed and simplistic and dangerous, but then he went on to describe the situation as no less grave, and he termed the separation wall in the same interview between Israel and the West Bank as truly apartheid. Separation is apartheid. Meron rescued the Quaker Legal Aid Office when the Minister of Social Affairs was trying to shut it down. Meron was also instrumental in getting approval for the Quaker Legal Aid Office to operate in the Palestinian sector way back in 1974. So it's people like him that keep you going in this. When we speak of apartheid today and apply it to Israel, it's not a metaphor or a comparison with South Africa. There is now an internationally recognized statute defining the crime of apartheid. It was actually begun in 1973 and states began signing on to it. It was incorporated into the statute of the International Criminal Court in 2002. So when the human rights organizations apply the label of apartheid to the present reality in Israel and the occupied territories, they're not comparing it to South Africa, although that is the origin of the word. They are comparing it to the legal standard as defined in the statute of the International Criminal Court. The first Israeli organization to apply the apartheid charge was an Israeli legal organization called Yesh Din. There is a law. In 1920, they termed the occupation of the West Bank the crime of apartheid in their legal opinion. In 2021, Israel's leading human rights organization, B'Tselem, and B'Tselem means in the image. Man is created in the image of God. They applied the apartheid label because immigration to the state of Israel is for Jews only. Israel is taking over land for Jews while crowding Palestinians into enclaves. It is restricting Israel's freedom of movement, and it's denying Palestinians the right to political participation. Chief among those is the right to vote. So also in 2021, the first of the international human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch, determined that the threshold had been crossed and there was an apartheid reality. And then in 2022, most recently, Amnesty International. If you're interested in reading anything more about any of these groups, their reports are all on the web and can be found very easily by simply Googling their names and the word apartheid. Even among the American Jewish community, in 2021, 2 years ago, the Jewish Electorate Institute asked a national sample of Jewish voters, is Israel an apartheid state? And you see an interesting difference by age there. 38% of American Jews under 40 agreed that Israel is an apartheid state. 32% said that to say that is anti-Semitic, and 15% disagree but think it's not anti-Semitic. And you can see the percentages in the other age groups. But fully, almost 40% of young American Jews agreed with that statement back in July of 2021. And we come back now to initiatives by our Quaker organizations. The American Friends Service Committee for the last several months has been mounting, along with other faith-based organizations, an apartheid-free campaign, urging groups to join, to take a declaration to declare themselves apartheid-free and join in efforts to try to change the reality. So far, there are about 162 organizations that have joined the campaign. 71 of them are congregations, including 10 Quaker meetings, including about 8 Jewish organizations, and that campaign will continue. We have some literature about it over on the bench there. So we will conclude quickly so that we can have time for discussion and questions. But there are 5 things that AFSC 3 days ago suggested we need to know about what's happening in Israel and Gaza, and I think it's worth referring to those as we conclude.
First of all, and these 5 things have been updated since the original 5 things AFSC published. And the first one is violence did not begin with the attacks on Gaza. That's very important for everyone to know, that the violence has, it goes back years and years, even before October 7th, one of the most violent years in Palestine in more than a decade. At least 247 Palestinians, including 47 children, had been killed by Israeli soldiers and settlers before the end of September. And this is the situation of apartheid was so clear to us when we were there last March. It is almost impossible for Palestinians to move from one city to another. You have to get a special permit to go into Jerusalem if you live on the West Bank, and so forth. Secondly, AFSC notes that Gaza has been under a violent blockade for more than 16 years, a total lockdown. People have not been able to move into the West Bank or into Israel itself. Thirdly, under international law, both Palestinians and Israelis have bounded legal rights to use violence, but violence will not bring just and lasting peace. So both Palestinians and Israelis have used violence under an international law, but this violence will not bring peace. 4, the U.S. funds arms and supports injustice, inequality, and violence perpetrated by the Israeli government. And by the support that we have provided and the munitions that we have provided, this violence has continued and is something that we need to address. And then finally, 5 things you can do to take action to bring change. And there are some of those that are listed there. First of all, everyone has a role to play. The most important thing you can do probably is to contact your members of Congress, contact the president, make contact, let your voice be heard. Send emails, send notices, send whatever word you can to let people know of your feelings. Second, donate to humanitarian efforts in Gaza provided by Quaker organizations and others. And third, join the apartheid-free campaign. All of these things we as Quaker meetings can do and we as individuals can do. And this is something that we strongly hope will happen and recommend. Jim, you want to continue?
And we'll just conclude. Folks can read that extract from Peter Boehnerdt's article in today's Times. He speaks of ethical resistance, something that we can all think deeply about. And we'd like to conclude with this X, formerly Twitter, post by Daniel Barenboim, the famous pianist and conductor. We saw Barenboim perform at the Kimmel Center a few years ago, and he was autographing CDs. So we went up to him and we thanked him for his witness on Israel-Palestine. He's gotten a lot of grief for it, but he's been courageous in making alliances with Palestinians. His East-West Divan Orchestra includes Palestinians and Israelis that perform around the world and every year at the London Proms. And he writes, "I have followed the events of the weekend with horror and with the utmost worry as I see the situation in Israel-Palestine worsening to unimaginable depths. Hamas's attack on the Israeli civilian population is an outrageous crime which I condemn fiercely. The death of so many in southern Israel and Gaza is a tragedy that will loom for a long time to come. The extent of this human tragedy is not only in the lives lost, but also the hostages taken, homes destroyed, and communities devastated. An Israeli siege on Gaza constitutes a policy of collective punishment, which is a violation of human rights. Edward Said, the Palestinian professor, and I always believed that the only path to peace between Israel and Palestine is a path based on humanism, justice, equality, and an end to the occupation rather than military action. And I find myself today grounded in this same belief more strongly than ever. In these trying times, and with these words, I stand in solidarity with all victims and their families."
And then finally, as Peter Boehner ends his article, he writes, "On Wednesday, a Palestinian friend sent me a note of consolation. She ended it with the words, 'Only together.' Maybe that can be our motto."
So anybody with questions here in the room or comments?
When you said people in Gaza couldn't move out of Gaza, you don't just mean move, like relocate their home. You mean like physically, like we would take a Sunday drive?
That's right. The borders, the strip is sealed by land and by sea, and there is no air route. Yeah, there is a permit system, and it can be possible with a great deal of effort to get a permit to receive medical treatment in Egypt or medical treatment in Israel. And there are a limited number of Gaza workers who have been given permits to work inside Israel. But for the vast majority of the population, movement outside the Gaza Strip on foot or by vehicle has been prohibited for the last 16 years. And the amount of goods allowed into Gaza has been strictly limited. There used to be a very bad joke at Israeli Defense Force headquarters in Tel Aviv that the army was putting Gazans on a diet as they were calculating the number of calories of food that could be allowed in to feed the population. It has been an unprecedented thing. And as astonished as I was by the Hamas attack, I have been astonished over the last 16 years that the international community has not made more effort to end this collective punishment. And the imposition of these inhumane conditions only feeds extremism and despair. So it's just mind-boggling that there hasn't been more effort to change that before.
If we looked at a map before the 1940s, the area that we're talking about, what name would be on that? What country name would be on the area that is now Gaza and Israel?
Well, that was Palestine, and it was the British Mandate of Palestine. That was the first time that the word Palestine was used as a state name, but it had been a geographical designation since antiquity. But the Mandate of Palestine was divided, recommended by the United Nations to be divided into a Jewish state and an Arab state. The Jewish leadership accepted, the Arab leadership, such as it was, rejected partition. A Quaker was supposed to be the mayor of Jerusalem as the only acceptable religious affiliation, but instead the outcome was decided by war. And if you look in the archives of the Western powers, there was never any expectation that it would be decided by anything other than war. There was never a coherent attempt to impose the UN recommendation itself. They realized the expectation in Western chanceries was that the Israeli forces were stronger, and indeed they proved stronger and took over a larger amount of territory, and that is the Israeli War of Independence, or the Palestinian Nakba, the Palestinian catastrophe, in which the 700,000 lost their homes, were forced to flee in some cases, fled in fear in others. I wonder how you would assess now the people fleeing from northern Gaza to southern Gaza. Is that forced expulsion, or are they fleeing in fear? There's not much difference between those two in the circumstances.
And it's very unclear whether they will be allowed to return or can return back to their former refugee homes.
Do you think Palestinian civilians feel that they're under a double siege under Hamas rule as well as Israel?
Many certainly do. Hamas, one of the calculations behind the Hamas attack is probably their perception that they were losing support in Gaza and elsewhere. And yes, many Palestinians, Hamas has its supporters. The religious right is strong in Christian, Muslim, and Jewish societies in the 21st century. But there are many, many Palestinians who abominate Hamas and who do feel they were under a double siege. Many of them have used exactly that expression. But Hamas has had its supporters as well.
Is there any democratic movement within Palestine?
Yes, and suppressed by a variety of actors and interests. So the Palestinians came within, I think, a week of holding elections about a year and a half ago. Our Quaker delegation, the Friends Council and Education delegation, heard from Hanan Ashrawi, graduate of the French schools, leading Palestinian intellectual, explaining this. And Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian president, whose term expired about 16 years ago, called off elections at the last minute, allegedly because there were unsatisfactory arrangements for Palestinians in East Jerusalem to participate in them. But in fact, because the U.S. was happy to see those elections canceled, Fatah, Mahmoud Abbas's party, feared that they would lose, because at that point, Fatah factions were putting up multiple candidates, and people were impressed. This is before the atrocities. People were impressed that Hamas was putting up respectable professionals to run for office. So the elections were canceled at the last minute. There have not been elections in, I think it's close to 20 years. And Israel, the United States, and the Palestinian Authority have all concurred in seeing that the periodic expression of the will of the people not be allowed to go forward.
The southern, I think it's 11 kilometers of Gaza Strip is borders Egypt. Does Egypt have anything to do with this?
Egypt has a great deal to do with it. Egypt is also an opponent of Hamas, which has ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, which the military government in Egypt has suppressed after they won the democratic elections in 2011 or 12. And there is an uneasy arrangement between Gaza and Egypt. Egypt supports the general blockade with Israel. But many of the goods that do get through to the Gaza Strip come through the Rafah crossing with Egypt. And it is a little easier for Palestinians to exit into Egypt in order to get medical treatment or occasionally to travel to school or things abroad. But the Egyptians cooperate very closely with Israel. And they recognize that Israeli consent has to be obtained for anything that happens. The Egyptians may have been willing to open the Rafah crossing earlier in the last week, but Israel has repeatedly bombarded it, so it hasn't been possible. And if what we hear is correct, the US and Europe are currently talking to Egypt and Israel about allowing humanitarian supplies in from Egypt and allowing foreign nationals at least to leave from Egypt. But the American citizens who are trapped in Gaza have not been able to get out either, because the crossing has been bombed and Egypt and Israel have together kept it closed.